Hey, what's up? It's John from Coding Addict, and welcome to AWS CDK version 2 with TypeScript course. In this course, we're going to learn AWS CDK by building a bunch of fun and practical projects coded step by step. Now, if you're wondering what is AWS CDK, let me break it down. AWS CDK stands for Cloud Development Kit, and it's a tool that lets you define your AWS infrastructure using actual code instead of writing long, repetitive YAML files like you would with CloudFormation. Under the hood, AWS CDK still uses CloudFormation to deploy your resources, but instead of writing everything manually, you get to use modern programming languages like TypeScript, Python, Java, and more. This means you can use variables, loops, functions, and all the things you're already comfortable with to manage your infrastructure, which makes things faster, cleaner, and much more reusable. In this course, we'll be using TypeScript. So if you know some JavaScript or TypeScript, you will feel right at home. And while our main focus is going to be on the CDK, we'll also get hands-on with other services like Lambda, S3, API Gateway, DynamoDB, and more. So you'll see how everything connects together in real projects. So if you want to level up your cloud skills and build real projects along the way, you are in the right place. In order to follow along with the course, you'll need 4 things. First, a basic understanding of JavaScript and TypeScript. Now, you don't need to be an expert, but you should be comfortable with things like types, interfaces, functions, imports, and for example, working with objects. Second, AWS account. Don't worry, I'll show you how to set that one up in one of the next videos. Third, a Node.js installed on your computer. Now, since this is somewhat of an advanced course, I'm assuming that you already have it, and you can always check by navigating to a terminal and just type node-v, whether you have Node installed. And lastly, access to the course repository, since it contains all of the project files, a README with challenges, code examples, and other helpful resources. And you can find the repo on my GitHub. Just look for AWS CDK course in my profile. So look for my profile, more specifically the AWS CDK course, get a hold of the repo, and continue with the videos. Now, the one thing you'll absolutely need in order to follow along with this course is a working AWS account. If you don't have one yet, you can use the link I provided in the README or just search for AWS account online. And most likely the first link that you'll see is this one, aws.amazon.com. One more important note, even though you can complete the course without spending any money, AWS will still ask for a valid credit card to sign up. So you won't be able to register unless you can provide a valid credit card. But I can assure you that during the course, my plan is not to spend any money. So essentially, all of the services we're going to be using are going to be for free. Or if there's going to be some cost associated with that, I will mention it beforehand. So at that point, it's up to you. If you want to follow along and actually create that service and test it, you can definitely do so. If not, you can just take a look how I'm doing it. And then whenever you need to use it in your own projects, you'll know how to do that. They might also recommend setting up a multi-factor authentication. And in my case, I did enable that feature just for extra security, but this is totally optional. So that one you can pick and choose. But credit card, you'll for sure need to provide. So if you haven't done that yet, go ahead, create your account, and continue with the videos. And once you create the account and log in, this is going to be your dashboard, aka console. And I'm not going to spend too much time covering all of the options we have because there's a bunch of them. And the plan is actually throughout the course mention important parts about the console as we're covering some particular service. As you can see in here, we can see the cost, We can also see the services. So this is what we're going to be doing all throughout the course. We'll be creating services and we'll be connecting them with the code. And in here, you can see the most recently used services. We can also search for services. So for example, I can type S3 and I'll be able to find it. And actually, the first thing that I want to set up in the console is the region. I can tell you right away that as far as the course and most likely for your own personal projects, you can pick any of these regions, but obviously it makes the most sense to pick the region that is closest to you, simply for the latency. But again, in order to follow along, you can stick with the default one, which I believe is the US East one. The main part here is once you pick the region, even if it's the default one, stick to that region, because otherwise stuff is not going to work. Now, what am I talking about? Like I just said, throughout the course, we'll be creating services and we'll be connecting them. We'll be setting up the permissions, the roles, and all kinds of cool things. And even though some services, like for example, S3 are global, meaning once they're created, you can access from any region. It's not the case with, for example, Lambda. If you set up a Lambda in your region, and then for whatever reason, and trust me, I have done that more than once, create another service in a different region, set up the correct code, stuff is not going to work. And at least in my case, I'm running around like a headless chicken trying to figure out why stuff is not working. And then I can see, oh yeah, it's actually in a different region. What a surprise. So make sure that you just stick to the region. That's the main point I'm trying to say. You can pick any of these regions, but just make sure that in the future videos where we're configuring the user and all that, you are using the same region. Otherwise, you'll just be chasing bugs where technically there is no bug. The code is correct. The service is just in a different region. And once we have picked the region, I think it's also very useful to set up a budget. You have probably seen the memes on X or some other social platforms where people have gotten some large bills from AWS simply because they did not check that the service is actually all the time generating the cost. So before we continue, let's set up the budget. This probably is going to change if you're watching this in the future. For now, it's located over here. We go to billing and cost management. Don't freak out by these numbers over here. The only reason why this is so huge is simply because I registered the domain with AWS, because during the course, I want to show you how we can attach the API gateway to a custom domain. And this is one of those things where technically this is going to be optional. So don't think that this is the cost. You're going to see, again, in your case, you'll see a bunch of zeros since they do provide quite generous free tier. So once we navigate over here, we're looking for the budgets. Like I said, I already have it. And yes, it looks dramatic simply because I bought that domain. Trust me, it's not going to be your case. We're going to go over here to create budget. We can go with the template and you can definitely set up the zero spend budget. That is also an option. But I'm going to go over here with customize just to showcase how it's going to work. We have a cost budget. Yep. Then we go to next. Let's come up with a name. In my case, I'm just going to go with test budget since most likely I'm not going to keep it. In my case, the period is going to be monthly. Let's start with the June, and I'm just going to stick with my $10. Yep, let's go to next. In the step number 3, I would like to create 2 alerts. One is going to be for what we're planning to spend, our target, and the second one will be forecasted, where AWS is going to predict the future spending based on our current usage patterns. So let me create the first one. In my case, I'm just going to stick to some generic amounts. I'm going to go with 80% of the actual, meaning it's going to be $8, correct? Since my budget was $10, and we will need to provide over here an email. So I'm going to go with learncode@mail.com. And also let's add another one. So in this case, I'm going to go with 80%, and this is for the forecasted one. This is where AWS can predict based on our usage patterns. So learncode@mail.com. Let's set it up. Go to next. We have 2 alerts, then next, and then we can create the budget. All right. And once we have the budget in place, the last thing that I would like to do in the console before we switch to a local environment is to set up a CLI user for AWS CDK so we can safely deploy our resources from the command line without using our root account. And we're going to do that in the identity and access management service, where we can create users, permissions, roles, policies, and all that cool stuff. And as a side note, this is not the last time we're going to be using this service. So as we're going to be progressing with the course content, we will be setting up the roles and permissions. The only difference, we're not going to do that in the console. We'll actually do that in our code. In order to get there, at least in my opinion, the fastest way is to navigate over here, and you're looking for IAM service. So Identity and Access Management Service. As you can see, for now, I just have the roles and policies that come by default from the AWS. We want to navigate to users. We want to create a new user. In my case, I'm going to call this Coding Addict CLI. Now, if you pick this option, you'll be also able to log in with this user, but that's not something that I want to do. Let's click on next. Then when it comes to permissions, you want to go to attach policies directly, and we're looking for the admin one. So we are looking for administrator access. That's the one that we want to pick. Then let's click on next, and we want to create the user. Once we have created the user, let's click on it. And now we want to set up the access keys. In order to do that, we need to navigate to security credentials. Let's keep on scrolling. And as you can see, at the moment, we have 0 access keys. We want to create one. And we want to pick command line interface, or CLI for short. They're suggesting an alternative, but we're not going to use that one. Let's click on next. And I'm also going to skip this description tag value. Let's create it. One thing to note, this secret access you'll be able to see only once. So in the following video, we will configure our user. And for that configuration, we will need the secret access key. So you have 2 options. Either leave this browser window open, basically don't close it, or just copy it temporarily somewhere. Let's say in some temporary text file or something along those lines. Now, it's not the end of the world if you forget to do that, but you'll need to create another key. And as I know, they're actually saying that right here as well. So decide how you want to get a hold of the secret access key. In my case, I believe I'm just going to wait, and I'm going to click on done once I have configured my user, which is actually something we're going to do up next. Okay, and once we have the CLI user in place, up next we want to install 2 libraries. So the first one is going to be the AWS CLI one, which is going to allow us to manage our services from the console. And second one will be the AWS CDK. Now, I'm usually not the biggest fan of installing stuff globally, but this is the case where we will need to bite the bullet. You can technically skip the second one, and I'll show you how we can run the command without installing this one globally, but we'll definitely need to install this one over here. I think I'm going to do it in the integrated terminal. Please keep in mind that since we're installing globally, it doesn't really matter where we do that. So right now I'm located actually in the course directory, and I just want to run this command. Yes, I already have this library installed, but I'm just going to run that one more time. And if you get some permission errors, just add sudo, which is going to ask for your password. And once you provide it, you'll be able to install this particular library. The second one is for the CDK, which, like I just mentioned, technically we can run with npx. But in order to showcase how you would install this one, I'm going to run it, and I'm just going to add this sudo over here. I think it's going to be more useful if I add over here sudo right away. So once you're working with the README, you already have this one in place. And in order to check whether the install was correct, we want to run AWS version, and we also want to see the CDK one. And we'll definitely need this one over here. And once we have the library in place, this is where we want to configure our user. So we created the user in the AWS console. Now we want to configure locally. And as a result, we'll be able to push our stacks to AWS. The way we do that is following. We want to run AWS configure in our console. And this is from my previous user. So now I just want to navigate back over here and provide the new values. The secret access key, like I mentioned before, we want to provide that value. Notice my default region is right away EU North 1. Again, make sure you double check and use the one that makes most sense to you. So again, I'm going to provide it over here. And then we want to set up the default output format, and I'm going to stick with JSON over here. And I want to make sure that I create actually the access key. Now we can see that it is active. And if we want to double check whether everything is correct, we want to run this command, which is basically going to return the info on the user that is configured right now. Also, we can navigate to a specific file, AWS credentials, and there we'll see the info on the user, and also we have the place on Windows. If you run this command and you can see that it points to the user we just created, you are in good shape, and you can move on to the next video where we're going to create our first stack with the AWS CDK. All right, and once we have the user in the console and we also have configured it correctly locally, up next, let's create our first CDK stack. And in order to do that, we want to create a new folder. In my case, I'm going to do that in a desktop. As always, the location is totally up to you. And I'm going to name this first CDK. Please keep in mind that this name is used when the stack gets created. So for example, I suggest avoiding numbers. Otherwise, you might have some weird errors when it comes to the stack name. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a second. Once we have the folder, let's open up our text editor. In my case, it's going to be Visual Studio Code. Yep, we trust the authors. Then we want to open up the integrated terminal, and the command we're looking for is CDK init. Or if you did not install the AWS CDK globally, then you can always go with npx CDK, and then whether that's diff, init, deploy, and rest of the commands. I want to tell you right away that since at my work I always run npx and then CDK, I don't have it globally, most likely I will keep using the npx even though I have installed it globally. Just something to keep in mind. I'm not a robot, so usually I keep forgetting things. All right, I'm done with the blabbering. So now let's go with npx, CDK, and init. Now, this is going to give us three options. We have app, we have a lib, and we have the sample app. And as you can see, we can pick which language we want to go with. And in our case, since the course is on AWS TypeScript, guess what? We're going to use TypeScript. As far as the sample app, this one already comes with some resources, and I believe in the beginning it's just going to be overwhelming. It's always my approach to start everything from the scratch. So if you go with sample app, basically we'll need to delete some resources just to showcase the nuts and bolts of the CDK app. That's why we're not going to go with this one. Lib1 is useful if you want to create some reusable components across multiple projects. Again, something we're not going to do in this course. And therefore, we're going to go with the first one, the app one, which is going to be the template, the bare bones template for CDK. And then we'll set up all of the resources and rest of the good stuff. So let's go here with npx CDK. And you know what? We can just probably copy the command. So let's go here with CDK init app. Correct. If you have it globally, again, you don't need to add this npx. It's just a bad habit or simply a habit that I have. So TypeScript, okay, good. We run this one. And if everything is correct, this is going to set up our template for the CDK. It creates following files and folders. So we have bin over here with first CDK. And this is what I was talking about, that it uses the name of the folder, and therefore be mindful how you actually call the folder. Of course, you can rename all of these things, but from the get-go, just something to keep in mind. And in the bin one, you'll find the CDK app entry point. And don't worry, we will come back to this file in the following video. For now, I'm just giving you the general overview. Then we have the lib folder. This is where we have our initial stack definition. And throughout the course, this is where we will be setting up our stacks with the resources. We have node modules. So this is where we have all of our dependencies. You know what, let me zoom in even more for now. A test folder where we have the test files. Git ignore, which just says which files are going to be ignored by the source control. A CDK JSON, which is a CDK configuration file. A package JSON, where we can see what packages are actually installed. So we have just node, just tsjust. So this is all for testing, obviously, apart from the types node. Then AWS CDK, TS node, and TypeScript. So this is useful since we want to run TypeScript in our node project. And we also have AWS CDK lib and the constructs. And we'll discuss these ones in the following video. And when it comes to scripts, this is what we see over here. But we're actually going to discuss the commands once we navigate to the README. So just bear with me. And at the very end, we have over here this tsconfig JSON. That should do it for the overview of the files and folders. And in the next video, we'll discuss in greater detail what we have in the first CDK stack, what we have in the bin, the first CDK file, and also we'll go over these commands. And up next, let's take a look at these three files, the first CDK stack, the first CDK one, and then the README. In here, if you are just coming from the front end, most likely this looks like a lot of gibberish, simply because in here we have a class. Don't worry, as far as the functionality, we'll really worry about the code that is inside of the constructor. But I do want to give you a general overview, what you're going to find over here. So we have this first CDK stack. Again, this is why I don't suggest starting with, for example, numbers when naming the folder, because as you can see, the name is being used. So this is going to be our first stack, which is extending this CDK dot stack. So this particular class extends from the stack class, and that just means that when we're creating our stack, we inherit all the properties and methods from the CDK stack. And then inside of the class, we have the constructor. So this is going to be invoked when we initialize our class, something we're going to do over here in the first CDK. It's looking for the scope, which is actually coming from the constructs library. So this is a fundamental building block when we are creating our stack. This is the construct. As you can see, it's used as a type over here. And generally, it's going to be app, which again is going to be located here in the first CDK. So you can think of it this way. This is where we create all of the stacks, and this is where they're going to meet when our app is going to be initialized. It has the ID, which is the string, and then props, which are optional. So later on, once we have multiple stacks and we'll want to pass some values between the stacks, this is when we'll use the props. And since we have a parent here, that's why I invoke this super, and then we pass in scope, ID, and props. Again, just some boilerplate code that we need to use. But as far as the functionality, everything is going to be sitting here in this constructor, or we might add some code here later on in the bin once we start passing some values here in the props. As you can see, the props is optional, so don't be surprised if you see empty object over here. And then at the very top, we have this AWS CDK lib. So this is the most important library because in here we can find all of the service constructs. And as you can see with the example, let's say they're using this SQS service and it is coming from AWS CDK lib. That's the main library that we'll use tons of times during this course. And then more specifically, it's looking for this AWS SQS one. So in here, basically, we can find all of the functionality that we need in order to set up that particular service. Yes, there's going to be some times where we need to import some more libraries and some more functionality, but in general, whenever you need to create a service, guess what? You'll need to look for AWS CDK lib, and then you'll need to look for that particular service. In this case, it's AWS SQS. And like I already mentioned 20,000 times, the main logic is going to be over here. This is where we'll be creating all of the services, permissions, and all of that cool stuff. Hopefully this gives you a general overview. Again, this is a class that just extends from the parent. And if we navigate right now to the bin one, you'll notice over here that this is a file that is executable by Node.js script. And in here, again, we import our main library, AWS CDK lib, and we also import our stack. We initialize our app, so new CDK.app, which is going to create a new CDK application instance. It's going to be root for our CDK application. And after that, we'll set up all of the children, aka all of our stacks. And as you can see, we import our first CDK stack. We pass in the app. Remember, this was the scope, correct? Which is a construct. And then the name is first CDK stack. Something, by the way, you can change. For now, I'm going to leave it as it is. And when we take a look at the props object, you'll see that it is an empty object, like I just mentioned, since it is optional. And in here, we just have a bunch of the comments. And then later, when we create another stack, same deal. We're going to import it here. We'll need to make sure that we pass in our app, our scope, and then obviously set up the name and potentially provide some props. Hopefully that is clear. Again, bunch of the boilerplate code, which for the most part, we won't have to modify, but just wanted to give you a general overview. And lastly, we have over here a README file with a bunch of the commands. We have npm run build, which is going to compile TypeScript to JS. Something we're going to discuss a little bit later simply because I want to focus on a code first, and only when we are ready to deploy our stack, then we'll come back to this one. Then we can run the watch one, which is going to watch for changes and compile right away. Something I don't use, so most likely we won't use it throughout the course. Then we have a test one. So if we set up some test files, we can definitely test our project with just unit tests. Then we have deploy, which is going to deploy the stack to your default AWS account and region. Remember, this is something that we set up when we configured the user. Like I mentioned, under the hood, it runs some commands. For example, build. And this is the command we'll use quite often. Then we have a def one. So if we already have a stack on AWS and we added some changes, this is useful when we want to compare what changes we actually applied. And this is super useful in production environment. Again, as we're working on our tutorial stacks and all that, obviously, if something is wrong, it's not a big deal. We can always remove the stack, which, by the way, they don't provide a command for in here, which is kind of strange. But if you're working on a production app, you don't want to start just willy-nilly deleting a stack. So this is super useful when you work in production. You want to make sure that the changes you apply to the stack are actually the ones that are going to be implemented, because mistakes happen and you don't want to obviously introduce them to your production project. And then we have the synth one, which is going to synthesize the CloudFormation template, which is also something that I would like to show you with the actual example. And therefore, I think I'm going to leave this one until we have already a stack on AWS. Since that way you'll be able to see that we have a local template and we also have one on AWS. And under the hood, deploy runs both of these, the build and the synth. And again, when it comes to the deploy one, it saves that build in the memory instead of generating those files. So don't be surprised if you don't see the files generated like you will with npm run build. It still works because it just saves that info in the memory. And like I already mentioned quite a few times throughout this video, the command we're going to use the most is going to be the npx CDK deploy one, because it will start up all of the processes. This is going to create new resources. It's going to update existing ones. It's going to delete them. It's going to compare them and rest of the good stuff. So yes, throughout the course, this is the command we'll use quite often. And I think this should do it for general overview. And with this in place, I believe we can start creating our first resource, which is going to be the S3 bucket. Okay, and once we have our stack in place, let's start setting up our services. And the first service we will set up is AWS S3, or Simple Storage Service. AWS S3 is like a giant digital storage unit in the cloud. Think of it as a massive online warehouse where you can store any type of file, from photos and videos to documents and website files. It is designed to be incredibly reliable, with Amazon promising 99 point, and then I believe it's like 10 nines after the dot percent durability, which means your files are almost guaranteed to never get lost. S3 is also highly scalable, so you can start with just a few files and grow to store millions without any issue. The service works through a simple web interface, which obviously we will explore once we deploy our stack, or programmatic access, which is something we're going to do later on in the course, making it easy to upload, download, and manage your data from anywhere in the world. In the S3, we organize our files into what are called buckets. Think of a bucket as a top-level folder or container for your files. Each bucket has a unique name across all AWS, and we'll see the error, what we get later on, if the name is already taken. And you can create multiple buckets to organize your data in different ways. For example, you might have one bucket for website files, another one for user uploads, a third one for backup data, and hopefully you see where I'm going with this. Buckets are the foundation of S3 storage, and they are what we will be creating in our first CDK stack. All right, and once we have the general idea, what is S3, essentially what we will be creating, let's get back to code and start setting up our first bucket. But before we start typing the code, I do want to mention something. In the README, right above the first S3 bucket code, you'll find useful links back to the Amazon documentation, so the AWS documentation, where you can find more info on the CDK overall. Also, you'll find a link back to the Github Repo, where you'll be able to see the implementation for all of the services. And also, we'll have the CDK TypeScript API. So let's go one by one and kind of cover. Obviously, throughout the course, you'll be watching the videos, but when it comes to your own projects and more knowledge, these links are going to be super helpful. So first, let's navigate over here. Like I said, this goes back to AWS, and this is a very good resource that explains you everything that you need to know pretty much about the CDK. What is the CDK? What are the core concepts and rest of the good stuff? The second link is going to be for AWS CDK GitHub repository. And the third one will be for the actual API. And let me just showcase the S3 example. Let's say we navigate over here. We look for packages. Then we want to look for AWS CDK lib1. And let's find the S3, just so we can see what is going to be the result. We can see that this is Amazon S3 construct library. And then, of course, we can find more info on what we can do with this particular library, how we can create the service, what options we have. And similarly, we can do it over here in the API. Again, we can see at the top here the version we are working with. Sometimes, obviously, you'll be working with the older version. Maybe that's going to be the case. And same deal, we just want to find the service. Let me find the S3, since that's the one we're going to be setting it up. We can start with the overview. And again, we'll see the examples, we'll see the options, and rest of the good stuff. So as you're coding along, if you have any questions, feel free to utilize the links that I provided in the README. As far as the code, we're going to start here by importing everything from the AWS CDK lib /AWS S3. And you know what? Let me just first maybe delete the comments and everything. I don't think they're needed. I'll probably zoom in or zoom out. I'll decide whether that makes sense. So for now, let me just keep it this way. So we want to import everything as, and then come up with a name. As a side note, yes, of course, you can import a specific thing from library as well. Then you set up the curlies. But again, a common approach is doing it this way. Then we want to look for AWS CDK lib, then /, and then we're looking for AWS and then S3. As you can see, once we install the library, we will get these extra libraries as well. For example, S3. And then we want to go to a construct, and we're going to create that bucket. Remember, that's the folder where we will be keeping our files. We need to come up with a name. In my case, I'm going to go with bucket, then new S3. That's the import dot. As you can see, we have a bunch of options that we can explore. In our case, the one that we want to invoke is going to be bucket. And as you can see, it's looking for three things. It's going to need a scope, which essentially is going to point to our stack. That's why we will provide over here this. Then the second thing it's going to look for is the ID. That is going to be the logical ID that is used in the CloudFormation template. And also, you'll be able to see that in AWS console. And I'll show you where to find that. And lastly, you'll have props. So this is where you'll provide the options. For now, we'll just create the default S3 bucket. We're not going to worry about the options. But yes, throughout the course, we will heavily rely on the options to customize our services. And since it's optional, we can provide just empty object, and the result is going to be the same as not providing the params at all. Let's start by providing this. So now the bucket is tied to our stack. Next, let's provide the logical ID. Please keep in mind that it's not the same as the bucket name. That one we'll set up a little bit later. This is just a logical ID, which is going to be referencing the CloudFormation as well as the CDK. And in my case, I'm going to go with first CDK project bucket. And then, like I said, since props are optional, we can either provide it like this, or we can skip it. The result is going to be exactly the same. Now, since we will use props a lot, I will actually go with this empty object option. And once we have the code in place, technically we can deploy this stack, our first CDK stack, to AWS, and we'll have the bucket available in the console. But before we do that, I also want to showcase something very important, and that is the CloudFormation output, which at the moment is not going to make any sense. And technically, I can tell you right away that it is optional. However, when it comes to production applications, this is going to be super useful. And essentially what it allows us to do is to print something about this instance when we're deploying. For example, in this case, we'll take a look at the bucket name. And since you might not find this useful at the moment, I'll just provide a code right now. We will finish the deploy. And after that, we'll return to this topic, and I'll explain why in the production it's super useful. Because at the moment, you most likely are going to look at it and you're not going to find it particularly useful. In order to generate that CloudFormation output, we want to go with new CDK. Again, that's our input. And then we have CFN and the output. That's the one that we want to use. As you can see, it's looking for the scope again, which is going to be this. Then the logical ID. And also we have the props. And in the props, we'll actually access this bucket and we'll get some value. Now, it doesn't have to be the bucket name, which we're going to get. It can be all kinds of things, and you can do similar thing for other services as well. So this is not unique to bucket. Please don't think so. Then let's say bucket name. That's going to be my logical ID. And over here, I'll provide the object with the value property. Then I'm going to access the actual bucket. And as a side note, yes, later on when we'll have multiple services and we'll be connecting them, we will use these instances to grab the values that we need. For example, the ARNs, the names, and all kinds of things. So if I type over here bucket in my instance, what I'm getting back over here is a long list of things that I get from that bucket. In this case, what do I want to get? I want to get the bucket name. And then we can also provide over here description. And I'm going to say the name of the bucket. Like I mentioned, this is optional. And we will come back to this topic once we have deployed the stack. And once we have this code in place, I believe we're ready to deploy the stack. Just keep in mind that since it's our first deploy, I still want to go over the commands one more time, and there are some extra steps that we need to do. And as far as the deployment, remember the commands we have in the README. Here we first have npm run build, which is going to compile TypeScript to JS. So let's start with this command, npm run build. And what you'll see that in the bin and in the lib, we'll get some extra files. As you can see, this is going to compile the TypeScript to a JavaScript, and we'll also have the declaration file. Then we have CDK synth or npx CDK synth if you haven't installed it globally, which is going to generate the CloudFormation template. And again, the CloudFormation is the service that we're actually using under the hood, which is going to allow us to create and manage our entire infrastructure using code instead of doing that manually in a console. So let's run that command as well. So we'll skip the watch and test, and we'll also for now skip the deploy. I guess we'll come back to diff once we have already something in AWS. What am I doing? Why am I going with npm run build? I'm not sure. So we want to go with npx CDK, and then we're looking for the synth. This will generate this CDK out. And more specifically, we're looking for this template JSON. And inside of it, we'll find resource definitions, the properties, configurations, maybe dependencies, output values, metadata, parameters. And the purpose of this file is the blueprint for our AWS infrastructure. So once we push our stack to AWS, you will be also able to see that pretty much the same template is used to generate all of these services. So we don't need to do it manually. And once we're done with build command, the synth command, technically we can rush to a console and type npx CDK deploy. However, there is a gotcha. And the gotcha is following that before we can deploy our first stack in our region, and again, this is super important. This is not happening globally. In the region, we need to create the bootstrap stack. So if we navigate right now to AWS console, more specifically the CloudFormation service, you'll see that we don't have such stack since, we just created the account, correct? Now, in order to create such bootstrap stack from our local project, we need to navigate to the console, and we want to go with npx CDK and then bootstrap. That is the command we want to type. And now this is going to start executing essentially the commands in order to generate such bootstrap stack. And then once we have that one in place, we will be able to deploy our future stacks as well. In our case, obviously, it's our first stack. Now, what is included in the bootstrap stack? So we'll have the S3 bucket for the assets. And be careful, don't delete that particular S3 bucket. Otherwise, you won't be able to continue with deployments. We'll also have some identity and access management roles for deployment and some other stuff as well. As you can see, it takes a little bit of time in order to set up such bootstrap stack. Once we have everything in place, we can navigate back to AWS console, and we'll see over here that we have the CDK toolkit stack. And this is something we'll explore with our next stack as well, but I just want to mention a few things. For example, in here, we can see the resources that were actually created for us. So this is happening by default. And again, this stack is used by the other stacks that we're going to deploy a little bit later on. Remember, I was talking about the template. Well, notice over here, this is the template for the CDK toolkit stack. So this tells the AWS what services, roles, and other things need to be set up for this particular stack. Hopefully that is clear. And now we can finally navigate back to our local project. And we want to go with npx CDK and deploy. npx CDK and deploy. So now this will essentially generate our stack on AWS. It's going to follow pretty much the same process, but obviously it is going to be different than the bootstrap stack, simply because we have only one bucket. And if everything is correct, once the command is done executing, we'll see some outputs in the console. Again, I'll come back to the particular output in a second. What I do want to showcase, if we navigate right now to the stacks, we should see our first CDK stack. And under the resources, we should see our bucket. We'll also have the outputs, which essentially matches to what we have in the terminal. And this is coming from the code we wrote after the bucket. And we also have the template one. Like I mentioned, we have the template locally, and we'll have the same template here on the AWS as well. So again, this is just a logical explanation to AWS what to create for this particular stack. And obviously, as we're going to be updating, the template is going to get updated as well. And then lastly, if we navigate over here to S3 service, we'll see over here our bucket. So the first one is going to be used by the Bootstrap stack. Like I said, don't delete this one because it will create the mess. Second one is going to be our bucket, which we're going to explore in more detail in the following video. Okay, and once we have the first stack in place and our first bucket as well, I would like to spend this video on exploring some defaults when it comes to buckets. And one more time, I would like to go over the commands, the npm run build, npx CDK synth, and also the npx CDK deploy. And hopefully that is going to be the last time I have to cover them one by one, simply because I want to show you something important when it comes to npx CDK deploy. So when we add such code to the stack, we create a bucket with some default setups. And we can definitely explore this once we navigate to AWS. So this is going to be our bucket, and we can take a look at the permissions that we get by default. And one gotcha is following that by default, all access, the public access I'm talking about, is going to be blocked. So we'll still be able to access the bucket, for example, from within our stack. We'll be able to set up some code where we maybe upload or maybe we download something from the bucket. Yeah, that is going to be possible. However, by default, we will have this block all public access. So don't be surprised if you do following thing. And I'm just going to upload something to the bucket. So first, let me look for Pexel site. I'm just going to grab some random image. I'm going to download it. And then I'm going to upload to S3 bucket just to showcase that the main logic is going to work, but we won't be able to access it publicly, which you might or might not want. Again, that depends. There's certain instances where it's needed, the public access, and I'll show you how we can configure that later on. But for now, I just want to show you the default kind of setup. So let me grab my image. I'm going to rename it to something user-friendly image. Why not? Then we want to navigate back to our bucket. And when it comes to the things we upload to the bucket, they're going to be referenced as an object. So in our case, the image that I'm going to upload is actually going to be my first object. We go here with upload. Again, we can obviously do this programmatically as well. And we'll take a look at that later on. For now, I just want to go to my desktop. I want to grab my image and I want to upload it to my bucket. As you can see, I was successful. That's awesome. Then let's take a look. This is going to be my image file. However, notice something interesting. If I'm going to navigate right now to this URL, which should expose my particular image, well, I'm going to get this access denied. So don't be surprised if you create a bucket, upload something, and then you have no access to it. Essentially, that is by design. Now, before we continue with the code, I also would like to answer the question whether we can create such bucket here in the console. And the answer is yes, of course. We can navigate over here. We can create the bucket. We can provide all of the details. For example, in here, we can also right away set it up so the objects are available publicly, which is something we're going to do later on with the code. We can set up the default encryption and we can simply create the bucket. So why creating such bucket with the help of CDK is actually preferred? Well, you see, even though we can create the bucket, and there's going to be times where you'll maybe need to do it manually in the console, the problem starts when you have multiple services and you want to connect them. Meaning, let's say I have a Lambda that is going to upload something to the bucket. It's not just creating that Lambda separately and the S3 bucket, like I just showed you in the console. We also need to set up the roles, the policies in the identity and access management service. And only for this simple example, it already becomes painful. And imagine if you have a bunch of the services that need to do something in order to accomplish one specific task. I'm not saying it's impossible. Yes, you can definitely do it in the console. However, it's going to be much easier to accomplish with the help of CDK, with the help of code. Also, when you work with a team of developers, what do you think is going to be easier? For somebody else to come along and see what actually you set up when it comes to a particular service. To take a look at the code where it clearly is explained all the properties and the roles and everything else you set up, or going through the AWS console and then trying to figure out what exactly has been attached. Again, yes, you can do it with the console, but this is going to be faster. Hopefully, I'm making this clear. And then lastly, like promised, I would like to discuss what we have over here as far as the npm run build and synth and how we can technically skip this with the CDK deploy. For starters, I just want to remove this. So this one is going to be the JS file, right? And then I'll remove the CDK out as well. And then I will remove the extra files from the lib here. And my point is following: when we run npx CDK deploy, what is going to happen actually, it's going to run under the hood the npm run build and npx CDK synth. Now, it's not going to generate the files like we did with npm run build, so don't be surprised if you don't see the files. But under hood, yes, it's running. It just saves it in the memory. And that way we can skip those two commands when we are ready to deploy. Let's say if I want to make some updates, I don't need to run again npm run build and then npx CDK synth. I can go with npx CDK deploy, and it's going to run both of those commands under the hood. And in order to showcase that, I'm just going to change the description, and I'm going to run npx CDK deploy. So I'm not going to change anything when it comes to actual stack. I'm just going to write random text. And you know what? While we're still on the topic, I can show you the diff command. So if we go here with npx CDK and then diff, this is just going to showcase what are the differences between the stack that we have in AWS and the one that we have here locally. And as you can see, we go from one description to another one. So now let me remove one more time CDK out, like this. And then let's run the npx CDK deploy. So now we'll actually deploy those changes. And if everything is correct, we're going to update our stack on the AWS based on what we have here locally in our template. And if everything is correct, our update is going to be successful. So as you can see, we can skip both of those commands by just running npx CDK deploy. And when it comes to the outputs, why they're so useful? Well, imagine this. Once you have a bunch of services, for example, once you have 10,000 S3 buckets in the AWS, what do you think is going to be easier if you need to find this name? Going through all of those buckets in the console, or you simply print out this particular name and then you can use it later on for something, be it in your code. Maybe you're actually using this value in order to find something faster in the AWS console. That's also an option, or for anything else that you would need this value. And obviously the answer is this is going to be faster And therefore, as your stacks grow, I believe you'll definitely see the need to use the CloudFormation output in order to get the values that you need faster. And therefore, in my opinion, you'll definitely see the use case of these CloudFormation outputs, which right away generate the information you need without spending unnecessary time in the AWS console to look for specific value. All right, and once we have our first stack on AWS, now let's see how we can remove the stack, because it's also super useful to know that. Just because you have the stack doesn't mean that it's always going to be there. There's going to be some use cases where you want to remove it. And during the video, I'll show you some gotchas you need to be aware of when it comes to the services and the removal policy. For now, I'm not going to show you the command. Let's just try to answer this question. If we delete the stack, so entire first CDK stack, what do you think happens with the resources? Do they get deleted or they are retained in the AWS? And the answer is depends. And it depends on the default policy for that particular service. So for some services, actually the default policy is to retain. And remember, we created that bucket with default policies. We even got that random name just so it's unique globally for that bucket. And it's done on purpose because, for example, for S3 bucket, we don't want to lose that data. And this is something you need to be very careful in the production environment. Even in the lower environments, it might be the use case where you want to retain that data. So yes, when you remove that particular stack, the resource is still going to be there. And here I listed some of the resources that will be retained and some of them that will be destroyed by default. So let's say if we create the Lambda, once we remove the stack, guess what? The Lambda is not going to be anymore in the AWS console. Now, in order to showcase that, I'm going to navigate back to my local project, and the command to remove the stack and delete all of the resources that have the removal policy set to destroy, we need to run this command npx cdk and destroy. So this is going to remove our stack from AWS, but guess what? Since we have this bucket set and we did not change any policies, it's still going to be there in the AWS console. So yes, we removed the stack. We can nicely navigate right now to our CloudFormation over here, and we can see that there is no stack. However, if we navigate to our buckets, we'll see that we still have the Bootstrap one. So please don't remove this bucket. But let's say if I don't want this bucket to be around, guess what I need to do? Well, I'll need to go to the console and actually delete it. Now, another gotcha with the buckets is that we cannot simply delete the bucket if we still have some objects in it. So if I'm going to go back to my buckets, click and try to delete, I'm going to get error, which is going to say that we cannot delete buckets if we have some objects in it. And the reason why I'm going over this, because when we're creating the stack, let's say with the CDK, and we want to destroy it, we'll hit the same errors. So don't be surprised if you hit those errors, because it happens in the console as well as the CDK. This is just the behavior of the S3 bucket. So in here, we are just going to go with permanently delete. That's what they want us to type. And in order to save a little bit of time, I think I'm going to do it this way. So yep, we want to remove everything that we have in the bucket. Let's exit right now. And now we can delete this particular bucket. They want us to copy the name. And since AWS generated the name, obviously it's going to be quite long, just so it needs to be unique. Let's delete the bucket. Now we don't have it. And in order to set the policy for the bucket to remove when we actually destroy the stack, we have a few options. For the S3 bucket, we can provide over here. As a side note, for some resources, you won't be able to do it, but for the bucket, we can. And the property we're looking for is removal policy. And now we want to go with CDK dot, and then removal policy dot, and now we want to go with destroy. So what's going to happen right now, when we create the bucket, and if we don't upload the object, this is important. This is coming up. What happens if we do have objects? What happens in the CDK? But if we don't have any object, it's actually going to be destroyed when we remove the stack. So let me run one more time CDK deploy. Let's deploy one more time the stack. Then we're going to destroy it. And as a result, we'll be able to see that this actually works. As a side note, if for that particular service, you cannot add the removal policy right away in the options, you can also do it this way. You can reference it. For example, in this case, it's going to be a bucket, and then apply removal policy. And we need to go with CDK. Pretty much the same. Removal policy dot, and we want to go with destroy. I'll comment out this one. So this one is going to stay for your reference. Let's navigate back to the console. If everything is correct, I hope it's clear that the stack exists. What I want to showcase is that when we navigate back to our project and run npx cdk destroy, since we have the removal policy set to destroy, and since we don't have any objects inside of the S3 bucket, when we remove the stack, we will also remove this resource. Again, for some resources, the default policy is going to be destroy. So technically, you don't even need to add anything. For example, Lambda. But for some resources, if you want to remove them when you remove the stack, yes, since the default policy is set to retain, therefore we'll need to add this destroy. And before we continue, I just want to showcase that when we navigate back to our S3 buckets, we're not going to have this stack. So $1 million question. Should you add over here this destroy to all the resources that, let's say, have the policy retain? Well, that actually is going to depend on multiple things. For starters, if you're working on a production application, that is obviously going to depend on the requirements. Most likely in the lower environments, you'll need to preserve this data, and therefore you won't be adding this policy. So be very careful with production projects. With your own personal projects, like for example, as I'm creating this course, I just don't like some random resources laying around in the AWS. It just annoys me. And therefore, pretty much for all of the services that you get retained, I will add this destroy. But please don't go to the production project and just start adding this. Don't do that. Again, I'm just doing this for my personal projects because I find it useful, since that way I don't have stuff laying around in the AWS. Second, what about the removal of the stack in general? And again, this is going to depend. If it's your personal project, I believe in the following video, I'll show you where we hit some errors, where we will need to actually remove the stack. So we will have to run that npx cdk destroy. However, when it comes to production project, is going to depend what kind of setup you have. So I've had experience where it's totally normal to remove the stack on normal environments and it gets rebuilt, like we just saw. So once we have the code in place, if we remove the stack, we can generate it back. But again, some resources have the policy to retain. And it matters when we start deleting the stack and creating a new stack from the scratch. We just haven't hit that issue yet, since we have only one bucket. So long story short, for your own personal project, it's okay to remove this particular service when you destroy the stack. It's definitely okay while you're learning to destroy those stacks, but just use common sense when you work on the production applications, because you might lose some data that you won't be able to recover. Hopefully it's clear, and we can move on to our next topic. All right, and once we have discussed the CDK destroy and also general info about the removal policies, let's also take a look what happens when we get errors. Because typically during tutorial, just like we have so far, everything has been moving smoothly. We deploy, we destroy, everything works as expected. However, normally you know that whenever you start working with technology, it's not going to be the case. You will start hitting errors, most likely pretty soon. And at least in my opinion, it's better to hit them right now when we have a simple stack and take a look at the solutions we have. In order to showcase one more thing about the removal, I'll actually create one more bucket. So I have bucket 1 and bucket 2. I'll just change the logical ID here. Let's say second, and let's deploy this particular stack. I'm not going to print anything. This was just to showcase how it works. So we want to go here with npx CDK deploy. If everything is correct, you remove the stack together with me. And this shouldn't cause any issues. And now we're just creating a new stack with bucket number 2 as well. And make sure you add this removal policy. Otherwise, the stuff I'm going to showcase is not going to work. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, in this video, we'll take a look what happens when we get errors and how essentially we can fix them. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to showcase all of the errors. That's one of the things. Most likely, as we're progressing with the course, we will hit them, and then we'll take a look how we can solve those issues as well. So at the moment, we have bucket 1 and bucket 2. If we navigate to the console, that should be the case. Again, I'm not going to showcase the stack. Hopefully it's clear that it's there. This is going to be our second CDK project bucket. And when it comes to the options, we can actually provide the bucket name as well. Otherwise, we get this generic name by AWS, which is awesome since it is unique. And keep in mind that when it comes to buckets, the name needs to be unique globally. So not just for you, but actually globally. And therefore, you have this long string of characters in order to make sure that it is. And in order to do that, we want to go to the bucket props. And the property we're looking for is bucket name. But like I just mentioned, this needs to be globally unique. So if I'm going to go here with my bucket, you can probably already guess that this name is going to be taken. So if we're going to go right now with, let's say, npx CDK diff, just to double check that it's the only change that we added. If everything is correct, we should get back the notification of our change. Okay, yeah, we are changing the bucket name, but we're not going to be successful. How do I know that? Well, because my bucket is not a unique name and it's definitely been taken. So when we deploy, as you can see, we will have the error. And this is the case where it's sort of straightforward error, where we simply just need to change it around. So we need to provide a name that is not specific. So notice we were trying to deploy and we hit this nasty red error. And the error says my bucket already exists. And the problem right now is that if I'm not going to fix this error, I'm not going to be able to deploy any of the changes. So let's say if I'm going to create another resource, since I'm still getting this error, I'm not going to be able to deploy. And we can take a look at that. If we navigate right now to AWS, look for CloudFormation. And inside of the CloudFormation, you'll see that we have this message. Then we navigate over here. We can click on events and we'll see that our first bucket is in the update failed state. So again, we won't be able to push any of the changes unless we fix it. And the good news in this case, the fix is quite simple. We simply need to make sure that this name is unique. So in my case, I'm going to go with my bucket 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then maybe let's add AWS CDK course, just some random values. So this is unique. And what I wanted to showcase with the destroy, if we have this removal policy set, when we'll comment out the resource, it will also be removed. To showcase that, let me navigate back to the buckets again. You know what? Let me do that in a separate browser tab. Let's navigate over here, S3. We have right now our 3 buckets, correct? We fixed the error. In this case, it was straightforward. We didn't need to do much. Just need to make sure that the name is unique. You can probably already guess that the second error I'm going to show you is not going to be that simple. We'll have to do extra steps. And if everything is correct, we'll also remove this bucket. So if we remove it from the code, if we have the policy set to destroy, or let's say it's by default destroy, remember for Lambda that was the case, then it's going to be removed from our stack as well. I think I'm just going to wait for the deploy to finish running. And if everything is correct, notice we're removing the second bucket. We have the unique name. So now everything is correct. And also, if we take a look at the CloudFormation, we have update complete, which is always a good sign. Now, let me show you a second error in this particular case, which is going to be harder to fix. So we won't be able to just change some lines of code in order to fix it. Let me navigate to the buckets. And in order to hit this error, as a side note, technically you can just watch. You don't have to do it in your stack. Let's navigate to the bucket and then upload the object. So I want to upload again that image, because if you remember when we were deleting the bucket in the AWS console, we only could delete the bucket if there are no objects in here. So make sure you upload the image if you want to follow along. And remember, we already have the removal policy set to destroy. So if everything is correct, once I run npx CDK destroy, we should remove the bucket. Correct? Well, let's try it out. npx CDK destroy. Let's run this. Yep, we want to remove the first stack again. And don't worry, in the later projects, we won't be removing so many stacks all the time. And if everything's correct, you will hit this error. The bucket you tried to delete is not empty. And in order to avoid this error in the first place, there's one more property that we need to add to our bucket, and that is going to be auto delete objects. So right after the bucket name, for example, I can go here with auto delete objects, and we're going to set this equal to true. Now, the problem is that since we already created the bucket, it's not going to fix this error. So if I'm going to go back over here and go with npx CDK deploy, I will still hit this error. And again, the problem is going to be the fact that I cannot add any more code or any changes, where again, my bucket is unfortunately stuck in this delete failed state. So yes, in this case, actually the solution is following. We need to navigate to our bucket and we need to remove those resources. In my case, it's just that image, correct? Let me delete over here. We need to verify this. Let's delete it. We're going to close over here and let's try one more time. So now we want to go to CDK and then destroy. And hopefully now, once we have manually removed those objects, we'll be successful. We'll be able to actually remove the stack. And yep, I don't see any errors, which means that we were successful. So just to showcase that when we are working with CDK, there's multiple errors that we can hit. We might have some errors that we'll be able to fix kind of smoothly by providing the correct info, but there's going to be some errors which will trigger the stack to break. And it's going to be in this loop where unless we fix it in the console, or let's say we destroy the complete stack and rebuild it from the scratch, we won't be able to basically find the solution. Hopefully that is clear. And with this in place, we can move on to the next task. All right, I think at this point we have covered the main building blocks of the CDK, which is going to help us when we start working on the more complex projects. And in order to finish this project, I want to create another bucket, and I want to showcase how we can allow public access and how, for example, we can download the static website. And then at the end, at least in my case, I'll destroy the stack and then we'll start working on the next project. I think I'm just going to use the same code over here. I'll start the same way. This is going to be my bucket number 2. I will leave this one since this one seems to be unique. Second CDK project. And the difference with this bucket, we'll just add more properties in here in the props. So we'll see what options we have when we are working with the bucket. Let's go with the bucket name. Again, let's try to provide something unique. So I'm going to go with AWS CDK course second bucket 1, 2, 3, 4. Hopefully this works. If not, remember, this is one of the errors we can fix quite easily. Then remember, at least in my case, since I don't want to retain this particular resource when I'm done with the stack, when I destroy it, I will set auto delete objects equal to true. And when it comes to the public access, again, please be careful. This is not something you want to do to every bucket, but in this case, since I want to show you how to upload static website, and in order to access the static website, one of the main requirements is the public access. I'll show you how we can deal with the bucket. Public read access property is what we need. This one we set equal to true. And then we want to create block public access property. We want to set it equal to new S3 dot. So S3 then dot block public access. In here we'll provide the object, and then there's a list of properties that we want to set it equal to false. Block public ACLS, we'll set it equal to false. Then block public policy, set it equal to false. And ignore public ACLS, also set it equal to false. And we'll say restrict public buckets, also equal to false, like this. These are the properties, and this is technically an extra, simply because I know that I'll be uploading the static website. I'll actually help AWS by suggesting which resource is going to be the index document, which basically is going to be my homepage. And the property we're looking for is website index document. And as you can see, we can also provide the error document, which is going to be our error page. I already know that in my case, it's going to be index HTML. We just need to add the comma. And now let's navigate to the console and let's create this particular stack. And where to get the static website? Well, if you take a look at the main course repo under 01 S3 bucket, this is going to be the project that we're working on. So you can always take a look at the code and also deploy it to your own AWS account. This is where you'll find the code that we have been writing so far. And in here, you'll also see the website folder with index.html and the main CSS. So these are the two files that I want to upload to my second bucket. See over here, yep, we want to deploy these changes. Let's just wait a little bit. And if everything is correct, we shouldn't get any errors and we should be successful. The stack should be there as well as our buckets. So now let's navigate to AWS. Let's refresh. we have our first bucket and we have the second one. And just to showcase how the CDK works behind the scenes, let's take a look at the first one. More specifically, let's take a look at the permissions, and we'll see block all public access. And as you can see, it's on. So that's why we cannot access the objects we upload there from the URL, for example. However, if we're going to go to the second one and take a look at the permissions, now this is going to be off. So as a result, whatever we upload is actually going to be publicly available. And since I want to showcase that, we want to go to upload. And of course, I didn't add any files and expect something there. We want to go, like I said, over here to the website, and let's just grab index.html and main CSS, because why not? Okay, we upload everything. And now we want to close this particular window. Then we want to navigate to the properties. We're going to keep on scrolling. And somewhere over here, we'll see this static website hosting. And if everything is correct, once we navigate to this URL, we will serve the index.html that essentially we uploaded over here. Let me click on the URL and check it out. If everything is correct, we have our static website hosted on the AWS. And the last thing that I would like to do in this project is to remove the stack. At least that is going to be my approach. Because like I mentioned, I just don't like to have tons of resources there while I'm making some testing project. So let me clear everything, and remember the command is npx CDK, or just CDK if you have installed it globally, and then we're looking for destroy. Yep, we want to click on yes, and our stack is destroyed. And with this in place, we can move on to the next project.